This is Unboxed by Aramex. It's a podcast of compelling stories and cultural perspectives. And with me is Butheina Kazim. Butheina is the founder of Cinema Akil, which is an independent cinema platform. It brings quality films from across the world to the audiences here in the UAE. From its permanent location in Al Quoz at Al Sakal Avenue, and now in One Central, a stone's throw from the Dubai World Trade Center. Butheina, it's lovely to meet you. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be in the same room.
So you are the boss. I was going to say cinemas, and I got that completely wrong. It is plural cinemas. You've got two now. It's your baby. It's your concept. The first thing I wanted to do, though, was to ask you, is it fair to say that Cinema Akil is art house cinema? And if it is, what does that really mean?
I'm still trying to figure that out myself. I mean, it's a decade-old, endeavor and no longer a baby. It is, by definition, an art house space, an independent cinema, an off the beaten track, pursuit of the moving image. And all of that are just fancy ways of saying that it's film that is dedicated to the art and the art form and the kind of the notion of unfettered storytelling and, a less systematic way of presenting films and less, exclusively commercially driven, exhibition practice or, box office mode.
I mean, it's something ever so slightly different, isn't it? I guess for most people, the kind of the road less travelled, I suppose. How did it all start? Because I've read a little bit about you. I don't know a huge amount, but it came from you were doing pop-ups.
Yeah. So the idea was always the finish line was always the 365-day offering or option for Dubai folks to have a different kind of, story or different kind of cinema projected, onto them. So having access, 365 days a year or nights a year to the kind of film that we were championing. And that, was obviously not a direct line. It was something we had to really experiment with in terms of both, understanding what we were going to create, like what was an art house cinema, what was a community cinema for this city versus what the notion of a community cinema or an art house cinema around the world looked like. So our sort of nomadic cinema or pop-up cinema was born out of that. It was an iterative, long, drawn out, insight collection, relationship building, community building, sort of long road to day one, which was, the opening of the actual brick and mortar space. And, that's just to say that, we, in that time we were nomadic, spent a lot of time revising the way that we were going to do this, understanding, how big or how small the place was going to be, how many seats we want to put in there, who are the collaborators we want to work with, what kind of films actually work and what kind of films don't work, what kind of programming did we think, would never work in this context, and, if we find out the opposite. So our first ever pop-up or experimentation was in Al Quoz, where we are now as a full-time location. Back when, the roads weren't as paved, a logistics hub similar to this one, but, a little more raggedy, let's just put it that way. And it was in a gallery called the Third Line Gallery that had, been operating out of this warehouse because of, there's the same reason artists and galleries move to warehouses, being the low rent and the sort of shabby chic, appeal of it all.
For sure.
And, they had the open-mindedness and the sort of commitment to cultivating community in Dubai, and said, the space is yours for 3 months this summer, program it as you please, and, use it as a testing ground for the kind of films that you really want to show in this 365-day setup. And that's exactly what we did. It was a office projector. I think it was 5,000 lumens, not so great, bean bags, multicolored, that you would never see in any of our spaces today. Manouche street snacks on the side.
Right.
And, amazing programming. We had Dial M for Murder by Alfred Hitchcock. We had Pathar Panchali by Satyajit Ray, the Bengali filmmaker. We had Dial M for, we said Dial M for, Like Father, Like Son, Koreeda Hirokazu. No by Pablo Larraín, beautiful Chilean film. So it was kind of like a smorgasbord of, of testing the palate and the appetite and the commitment people would have. And sure enough, people walked through the doors every single time, sat there, on the uncomfortable bean bags in the heat of summer, and came film after film.
Do you know, that interests me because in my head I'm thinking, so you're going to start something like this, you must be crazy, because who's going to come? Because Dubai famously is, I don't know, 200 nationalities, all different wants, needs, feels. How do you program for an audience that wide? But I guess on the other hand, you've got enough people there to come and populate it and to grow something that is really different. And I suppose was it kind of organic from that, or?
I would say it was exclusively organic because we didn't really have any money to spend on anything that was anything past that. Our most successful guerrilla marketing campaign was our stickers that we printed and gave out for free, and they ended up in places from Tokyo to Kerala, and people would send us pictures, find out these sightings. And I really think it was born out of a congregation of misfits like us. There were people who had the same curiosity, same people who had the same, a lot of people who had the same yearning, who didn't feel like there was something out there that spoke to them, who wanted more, who did their, real estate jobs, their advertising jobs in the day, and they wanted something a little more challenging at night. And this is what we, brought, forward. And yes, it wasn't, gold class seating. Yes, it wasn't truffle popcorn. Yes, it was in the middle of Alcoz. But all of these things actually was sort of a perfect recipe for imperfection that people were really seeking in this city.
It's a scene though, isn't it? You grew a scene, I guess. And that's kind of it's a very cool thing to do. Where does it come from for you? What turned you on to film? What was it? Was there a moment when you thought, I have to just sit, close the curtains, watch movies all day? Was that you, or how did it start?
Look, I wish I had a sort of more romantic Cinema Paradiso type story where, I was a little kid that grew up in a cinema and stood behind the projector.
You can make one up for me if you like. I'll believe it.
There is a version of myself that believes that I was that child, but unfortunately, my cinema did not burn down. But there is a version of that was actually true, because the cinemas that I grew up, going to here in Dubai included a cinema called Al Nasser Cinema, which is in Oud Meitha. Beautiful cinema right next to the Al Nasser Sports Club, football club, and that's where I watched a lot of my first films on the big screen. Everything from like Yash Raj films, Mohabbatain, and Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, to Titanic, of course, for all 3 times, 21 hours right there of my youth. Aquaman, and not Aquaman, Waterworld, the predecessor, Kevin Costner in his Find era,
Yeah.
So all of these films were kind of like this, introduction to what I would grow up watching. And Nasser Cinema, as a standalone, privately owned cinema before the multiplex, was that place for us where, we would eat, we would drink chai, have some samosas, and that was a cinema going experience. And it was quite, I would say, public facing. It was a place of, of easy access off the road, directly to the big screen.
Sure.
And that was a relationship I had, and that's what I thought was missing once we exclusively only had multiplexes. And the Nasser Cinema burned down. So it went up in flames. So there was a sort of community experiential part that I was missing. And then obviously the films themselves reigning supreme, right? The films that were not represented, and films that were, really hard to come by. And it became this really, crazy obsession of making sure that films that we're coming out of our region, from Tunisia to Iran to Lebanon, traveling to the Berlin Film Festival, traveling to Cannes, traveling to all these massive film festivals around the world, walking the red carpet, and not really coming home, not having the ability to access audiences where they are, their audiences. So I kind of took it upon myself to try that one out for size through the pop-ups and through, my previous endeavor as, working in broadcast and trying to buy these films for, a free-to-air television market. And that eventually translated into a physical space, and a consistent house for these films.
I mean, you need to be you need to be a real film geek, I guess, to do something like this, because very few people look at this and think, oh, there's a business I should do, because it's pretty tough, isn't it?
Oh my God. I mean, there's definitely a screw loose somewhere.
That's what I'm thinking.
And it never found its way home. But, I think I'm not necessarily the biggest cinema geek. I'm also not like the biggest cinema aficionado. I love my films. And I think, it is like I was saying earlier, like life itself. That's what cinema is. And it expands your ability to imagine the past and the future and the ways that we could be. And it also is the way we lock down, what we think of as like reality or imagination or political truth. And I think that's particularly like my obsession. I have an obsession with narrative, and I have an obsession with representation.
Right.
And that's what the cinema represented for me. And that's what I was fighting for, and I continue to fight for, is, a space in this, increasingly crowded world that, imposes ways of imagination and expression and representation and visibility onto us and onto our understanding, and carving out a safe space, a true place that represents what I think is, an untold or underrepresented voice.
That's a really interesting point, because at the moment it seems like you are either this or you're this, and you're not really allowed to be in between. And I guess in a weird kind of a way, that 2 hours of losing yourself, you can be exactly what you want to be, if depending on what you're watching, of course. But it's that you can just be yourself. Is that what it is?
I mean, part of that, yeah, I definitely think the cinema in the age of, video on demand and being able to control every little, aspect of the way that we, consume. And I hate that word. I use that between brackets, but we take in, the moving image. Cinema still has and retains the imposition or the power of requesting, if put politely, or imposing surrender. You are at the mercy of the 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, half an hour of the film that you're watching. Yeah. And that requires choice, right? You are kind of handing over your agency, and you're handing over, sort of your imagination to be stretched, broadened, challenged, through that time that you spend with the film. And to me, that's super powerful. Like you have probably, if you're somebody that, has never traveled to, I don't know, let's say Armenia, right? And you walk through the doors of Cinema Akil and you watch, Sergei Parajanov's masterpiece, Sayat Nova, or The Color of Pomegranates, which was the first, restored classic we've ever shown. You just have, your mind is just like fireworks, by the end of it. You're understanding it's not a National Geographic, story. It's not a Lonely Planet discovery. It's not even a ticket, to the city. It's like a, visceral, deep, soulful connection that is inexplicable, and that is ultimately the magic of cinema. And some films hit deeper than others, and to me, the deeper, like the more inexplicable, the more potent.
Yeah. You've just hit home something with me. I remember watching Lost in Translation, which is it's over 20 years old now, I guess. And it struck a chord, and I don't want to sound corny, but it hit me right here in the heart. And I've loved that film ever since. I don't know how many times I've seen it. I couldn't tell you. But it was exactly that. It was just that moment. And I guess it's partly cinematography and Japan and the relationship between Bill Murray and... sorry, I'm buying into what you're saying.
The Coppola gift.
That as well, actually, I guess. Yeah. Cinema is back in a huge way. And it's kind of funny, because not that many years ago, cinemas were a little bit shabby, 25, 30 years ago. Video, Laserdisc, DVD. We're all watching on our big wide screens at home, and all of a sudden it's huge again. What impact does that have? What's the multiplex effect, if you like, with the big movie releases on yours? How positive is that for what you're trying to do?
We coexist. I think I'm not a fan of like, I don't think art house cinema exists in isolation. Art house cinema is always responsive. It's always, exists within, because it is social cinema, it derives its power and appeal and interest through its interaction, whether it's with the street or the community that it's part of, or whether it's the issues that are affecting the community that it's, in dialogue with or in cahoots with, right? So I think, art house cinema always exists in sort of, response, pushback, in a sort of, happy or sometimes hostile tension with the multiplex, whether it's economically in terms of competition for, butts in seats or eyeballs on the screen, whether it's through the game of, volume economics, whether it's even through sometimes distribution slots, right? We compete with the multiplexes on, the ability to have things like exclusives on some films, on premiere dates, because ultimately you give a first-time filmmaker, a 20 screen slot, even if it's at 2 p.m. and nobody's going to watch it, it's a much bigger sell than, a single screening that will be a full house to a, 133 seater.
So just the fact that it's on is of huge benefit.
It's
the fact that it's listed, I mean.
For the filmer, yes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually going to translate into the critical acclaim around the film, or the right kind of audience.
Right.
And I think that's ultimately what the art house's job is to make sure that it's like an invisible filter. We don't do it by design, but because there is a common denominator that brings together the people that seek out this kind of, sort of parallel cinema, if you like, or third wave cinema. It's, it creates a certain kind of, filter of people that are somehow like-minded or like-spirited, I think, because every film is different. An anime film goer is maybe different than somebody who would be really interested in a, Wong Kar-wai retrospective, than a, Scorsese retrospective, or a Kubrick fan, or, Nadine Lebaki's latest film.
Okay. When you started, how did you program? And now that you've got 10 years plus under your belt, how do you program now?
I mean, one thing I'll say, like, kind of going back to your previous question and reflecting on this one, is that the ultimate sort of defining factor between the multiplexes and what we do is that we are people first, spaces. Yep. We are very much about the human experience, condition, tactility. So everything from the box office, and it's not just nostalgic and cute, like takes you back to the way that the golden age of cinema, It's not really that we're hearkening back to. It's actually this necessity, in a place where everything can be done behind your app, behind your screen. There is this yearning and this thirst that people have of contact and human contact, and somebody to yell at, and somebody to ask questions to, somebody to like, just ask, transact with. So those are things that, ultimately we design the cinema experience around. And, it involves listening to people. It involves having conversations in the cafe, and the cinema, cafe that we have, like, it's a big part of the the previews. It's not just about like that conveyor belt experience,
Sure.
You're in, you're out, you get your popcorn, you watch your film, and you're bam, spat back into the parking lot of the mall,
Yep.
Like, there is a slowness that, is by design a part of that contemplative experience. So that's kind of how we program the full. That's what we program. Having that in mind is how we program. How we select films is, like I said, it's it's the secret sauce. It's there isn't a particular scientific formula. It's not an chat GPT algorithm. It never was, and it still isn't. There is there are obviously some common denominators in terms of like critical acclaim, in terms of regional specificity and relevance. We pride ourselves in being a cinema that prioritizes films from the Southwest Asia, North African region because of their lack of representation in other cinemas. So we want to be a place that brings those films home, which is what we set out to do in the first place. So chances are, if a film, has sort of been made in the past few years and it's sort of traveled to the festival circuit, it will come home to Cinema Akil.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that actually, because I don't know. Take Cannes for example, the first festival that springs to mind. The films there that don't get the popular acclaim but get the critical acclaim, you're obviously watching and thinking, "Oh, that would be cool to show," or "That would be great to show." I mean, is those are the triggers, I guess. Those are the sparks that help you program.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the training. Like, that's the sort of the wisdom. You eventually build, what you can call intuition, but it's actually just, I think consistency and experience.
Yeah,
and that's what it translates into, is a sort of affinity and understanding, a constellation of whether it's insight, skill set, sensitivity, curiosity, commercial viability that comes together to form the universe of our programming. And sometimes it is a selfish choice. Like, it's a film that we want to take a bet on. We want to give it its fighting chance. It's a film that maybe never got, its limelight. Maybe the filmmaker didn't even know how to access, the distribution circuit, didn't have a producer that was willing to back it and submit it to festivals. Maybe it's a film that it was misunderstood. Maybe it's a film that, by process of exclusion, and this is a longer, winded, conversation around the sort of merit of the critical acclaim, because that also has its own problematics in terms of, especially films coming from the region. So they tend to have a particular kind of lens that makes it appealing to, a Western gaze.
Sure.
And so there's that kind of boxing. So we take it upon ourselves to try. And we sometimes fail, sometimes do a better job, and and think about what it is that represents us best, and what it is that deserves that audience and deserves that space to at least articulate, its mission or its view or its contribution artistically to the world.
Well, that seems very
And sometimes
much...
it's pure fun, I'll tell you that. Like, sometimes it's just like, you know what, like, this is going to be a riot to do a summer of classics focused on, all of the Scorsese films that everybody loves and just wants to have a chance to, just kick back in the middle of August, and watch King of Comedy,
Yeah. No, I understand that. But it seems very much that you're very much about being here. I mean, Arab Cinema Week, I know, is something that you are doing. Real Palestine is something else I wanted to mention, because I want to know more about them. But that's the right thing to be doing, isn't it? That's appropriate. That's where you should be.
100%. I mean, Arab Cinema Week is born out of that urgency and the clarity of mind, And sometimes when, you have a startup, you're kind of just trying to keep the machine rolling and trying to keep it afloat. Like, it's very different when you transition from pop-up and nomadic to, having to keep the lights on and having to, to pay the bills and having to, people's livelihoods depend on you day in, day out. So you make decisions that sometimes, take you astray, lead you astray, from what you set out to do. And you kind of have to revisit, have to have that moment of truth as to why you're doing what you're doing. And Arab Cinema Week was born out of that, is kind of this, reminder that this is what Cinema Akil is here to achieve, which is give that, well-deserved, respectful space for these films to come together. And the filmmakers also to come here and be in the city and, meet the audiences that do come out and champion their films. And for people to have this moment on their calendar with the absence of the Dubai Film Festival, the Abu Dhabi Film Festival, the Gulf Film Festival, all of these festivals that, were effectively disappeared. since 2017, and have this 1 week. We're not a glitz and glamour festival. We don't have a star-studded whatever that means red carpet. It's just a week of fantastic filmmaking, of incredible people that have made these films possible against all odds. And I really say that with a lot of intention, because every single film that you see at Arab Cinema Week is born out of struggle, right? Like, they're not just there like competing with a French film and a Brazilian film at the Cannes Film Festival. Like, they're born out of real real hardship, in terms of whether it's ecosystem issues, whether it's funding issues, whether it's political outlook, whether all the odds are stacked against you. If you're trying to make a film as an Arab filmmaker, let alone the philosophical and artistic kind of voice that you don't even have the luxury to own sometimes. So to us, it's like, what, this week is about that. Is about carving out space within our power. And, that ultimately is represented by the screen and by the seats and by the people that walk through our doors, trusting us for these films and letting them do their work. And for me, that was the decision, between making films. So back to my obsession with like narrative is either I was going to be making films and making, content, quote unquote, or in that time that it would take me to make a feature film, which would usually be a 3 to 4 year endeavor to make a really, solid, feature length narrative. I would have built a cinema that, has shown 2,000 films.
Yeah.
And that was the toss up. Did it mean that there were films that I would have liked to make and had to put on the back burner? Yes. And they still are. They're somewhere in the folder. So maybe perhaps one day.
Okay. So, I mean, these are the things that make you unique, though, aren't they? But you have to offer something. You offer a slightly different experience, but there are little things that you continue to, I guess, bolt on the experience. You mentioned chai, for example, at Al Nasser Cinema. You've got Project Chaiwala, and it's another thing. I want to know more about that, but it's another thing you can do just to enhance the whole feeling of being at Cinema Akil.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's all about intentionality, right? Like, if you're, we try to be as intentional as possible or conscious as possible in the decisions that we make. So whether it's who we collaborate with, whether it's what we'll have on offer, in terms of our menu, whether it's what color the bathroom lights are going to be and how does it make people feel, whether it's who our neighbors are going to be, whether it's, obviously what we put up on the big screen or the music, that we'll choose for this season's trailer. All of these things are the little windows of opportunity that we have as, folks with some level of, creative autonomy and, and not a lot, but some, expendable, revenue, on talent.
Expendable revenue. That's a great phrase. I love it. But I know what you mean. I do know what you mean.
That's where you should spend it. Spend it on, folks that ultimately will circle back to you. Everything you do is an opportunity to contribute to the life cycle, and it might mean that you pay somebody's gas bill, for that month, or it might mean that you green light their next project because of the commission you give them, and everything counts. So who you hire to do your emceeing, who you hire to, cut your trailer, who you, work with to sell your concession is ultimately, a little political decision, as a little, socioeconomic decision. And I think of everything that way.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about movies, really straightforward questions.
Sorry, I just want to answer your question about the Chaiwala thing. So Chaiwala and the tea and, that whole offering was about, again, like ownership and identity, because it was like obviously the nostalgia of what I grew up with when I thought of cinema going, but it also meant kind of reclaiming the cinema going, process and narrative, right? Like popcorn and nachos and, what we think of in a conventional supersized, concession stand is something that we imported, You know, it was sort of a
Absolutely
colonization
right.
of
Yeah,
our
yeah.
cinema going experience. So it was also a sort of decision we had to make. Like, do we want to just feed into that, you know, or do we want to do something that, you know, sort of offers something that is authentic to the place and how we remember cinema going and how cinema going continues to be in possibly, you know, one of like the second biggest, you know, market, cinema market on the planet. So we derived our inspiration, you know, from that. And it also was a truly Dubai, you know, authentic experience.
It harkens back to the times when those were the cafes. That's what you had. We didn't have I don't know, the big coffee names or whatever else, did we?
Yeah.
It's I hate the word authentic, but it is authentic.
It is authentic. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just been hijacked, but authentic is authentic. Like, you know, you
Yeah.
can't compete with that. Like, it's something that is born out of the place. There's an indigenous kind of like, it's a byproduct ultimately of Dubai's like trade, you know, position, right? Like that's how chai ended up becoming the snack of choice, you know, at a movie going experience, you know?
Yeah. That's a very good point. Authentic's the longest word I'll use in this podcast today. So I want to talk about movies with you. I do want to go back to something you said, though. What colour are the bathroom lights at the moment?
Red is the warmest color.
Red, nice. I like that. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about...
We are the red life district.
We'll keep that in. Movie or film, first of all? Which do you use? Is it a movie? Is it a film?
Depends how much of a snob I'm going to be today. I mean, they're both accurate.
Well, they are, but I would say film.
I mean, there is something, you know, there's something tactile, I think, about, you know, the word film, and I use it just as second nature now because I also think of it as like a parallel utility to the word.
Okay.
But it's semantics, you know, like movies are eventually how the art form developed in a North American, specifically Hollywood context. Like, the word movies came out of that.
Yeah.
Just like the talkies, you know, came out of introduction of audio to cinema. So there was the talkies before the movies.
So it's all interchangeable and it's all fine. So let me ask you then.
We have bigger fish to fry, Tim.
We do.
Yeah.
Like, what's your favourite film? Could you even think
You had
of
to
that?
do that to me.
I did, yeah. It's like a little dagger in the heart, just to wake you up. I mean, the other night,
Snuff out
there's a
your
reason
children.
I ask you this. Is the other night I was sat, my wife was out, and I was sat thinking, what am I going to watch? And I couldn't think, and I just thought, it's time for Caddyshack. And it's not because it's a great movie, because it's not. It's a silly movie, but I watched it when I was a kid with my mother, and she loved the gophers, the dancing gophers in it. If you've not seen it, watch it, and you'll understand dancing gophers. But I loved it, and it's kind of a guilty favourite, I think. So you could have a guilty favorite if you prefer.
But why do you think of it as guilty? I think there is, you know, like I say life itself, not to just aggrandize, you know, what we do. It's actually that, right? Everybody has a moment, you know, that are moments that are punctuated by the films that we watch, right? Like the way we think of the future. Like now there's a lot of conversation around us being in this city about, you know, the future humans and like how we're going to exist in a different, you know, in the years to come in light of AI and how we build and what we think of, you know, sustainability and universal basic income, like those bigger questions, right? And if you'd be surprised how much of the way that we build or the way we imagine the mood boards of the future are derived from cinema to this day, because those were the kind of languages or the kind of the stockpile of imagery that we were presented with when thinking about what we thought of as the future. And if we are creating a challenge to that, kind of an inverse reaction, like films like Her, for example, you know, that are very different in terms of like they've done away with the chrome and they've done away with a lot of that sort of, you know, apocalyptic, like, you know, Blade Runner aesthetic, comes as a result of like, you know, kind of countering that or wanting to counter that. So people have these very, what you call them, silly, these, you know, visceral, emotional, intimate, you know, manufactured and ultimately like brain drenched, you know, relationships to films. whether it's a scene in a film that
Yep.
speaks to you, or a
Yep.
character, or it's
Yep.
the music, or it's when you watched it, or who you watched it with. That's why ultimately, like, you cannot, no matter how many VOD experiences are out there, the cinema going experience, or like the communal aspect, which kind of derives its its power from sitting around the screen, be it at home or in the cinema, together in shared darkness. That is something that defines us all and defines moments of our youth. It defines our worst times.
It really does. I mean, music does it as well, doesn't it? It triggers emotions and moments and takes you back. But I'm not letting you get away with not telling me your favorite film.
I mean, look, it really depends, because I have my silly movies, and I have my,
Cool.
my films that I think of as like, the sort of the apex of, my intellectual curiosity around cinema. And I have movies and films that are just pure poetry, and
Yeah.
some, like, horses for courses, like, I have very different selective relationships with which, time and place and world I want to be a part of,
Okay.
So if on a, like, on a day like today, where, it's a flight of fancy, it's like this, wild, kind of destructive beauty, I would say, Gangs of New York is one of my favorite, favorite films of all
That's a
time.
mad film.
I love it. That's exactly
it's
it. It's the
great, but
madness, because
it's
right
mad.
now, that's what I'm feeling. It's a lot of madness, a lot of anger, it's a lot
Okay.
of hostility, it's a lot of, maybe, the fact that, we nothing, is explicable, and the sort of the outlaw, the reign of the outlaw is upon us when you look at, like, the illusion of international law governance. Maybe that's why this has a particular kind of, like,
Okay.
spike. The currency is up. Other days it's Metropolis by Fritz Lang, and the kind of the kind of stark inequality in the painting that he puts in front of us with this film. Maybe on other days it's, in a way, the OG film that really wanted me, that really kind of made me want to do this for some sort of living, is it was actually a DVD version of the film that I had, that ended up, in my collection. I was working for a broadcaster, as I was saying, and I was acquiring films, for that channel. And one of the films was an Iranian film by Bahman Robadi, who made a film about these kids that lived on the border of Iran and Iraq during the war. And it was about these kids that kind of were left to, their parents were killed, and they were kind of left to fend for themselves. And it's called A Time for Drunken Horses. And their youngest sibling was unable to, he was a paraplegic, and their whole, like, mission was to sell these scraps of metal, tires, for spare change, to be able to buy bread, and light a fire in their, close to their tent, to stay warm and to stay alive.
Right.
And they were trying to escape using donkeys and horses, and the way they would convince the horses to walk through the snow and through that cold was by giving them alcohol and getting them drunk, essentially, to get them to. So the horses themselves, couldn't bring themselves without inebriation to walk through that kind of hostile weather, and these kids were, escaping, for their lives in this circumstance. And in a way, like, the film keeps, the portrait he painted keeps kind of finding itself back into my consciousness because of the pure beauty by which he tells that story, without the intention to invoke pity. Like, every character, every child, as non-actors, had a lot of agency. Okay. And today, watching this film, in the shadow is a very timid word, of a genocide that we are all bearing witness to. It still remains a portrait that is honest and a sea of a lot of dishonesty. So I guess it's a reminder film for me.
It's not surprising that sticks with you. What do you not like? I was going to ask you what's your least favourite film, because there's two I can't stand. They're both British films, Love Actually and The Holiday. You know when the hairs raise on the back of your neck, but not in a good way. It's that for me. It's those two movies for no particular reason. I just dislike them. I was going to ask you for your least favourite film, but what do you like least in film or cinema? Let's broaden it slightly. What gets you? What disappoints you?
Blatant propaganda.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Like there are films out there that have been weaponized to create monsters out of people. Films like True Lies, films like Not Without My Daughter, films like, a lot of the Indiana Jones films. So there is a crisis, definitely, in Hollywood happening right now that's resulting in people pivoting to television as a result. And I also think, politically speaking, like from a representation point of view, the greatness of The Bear and the insistence on like complexity comes as a result of those pressures, which is making sure that you have representation not just on screen, like actually in the writer's room and behind the camera and across the board of experiences, and whether it's class, sexuality, race, and everything that that comes with, and that results in better storytelling. Ultimately, it's not about tokenism, and that's how I feel about representation. It's not just about like I want to be on the red carpet and we should get Grammys. It's actually like it makes better films. It makes a better world. Like that's just the world that I live in.
Well, that's what we should be striving towards, surely. I want to ask you about filmmaking and filmmakers here in the UAE, but also around the region. And as much as anything, I'm no expert, but just to gauge, if you can gauge where filmmaking is. It's a huge question, I know, but just your feeling, I guess, is what I'm asking for.
Look, I think, the disappearance of the monolith is definitely, sort of a big part of the reality of regional filmmaking as it stands today. There's no longer like one industry. Historically it was like, the Egyptian cinema industry in the region was, the sort of the be all and end all. It was what everybody watched. It was the biggest films, the ecosystem, the talent pool. I think now it's a lot more fragmented in terms of actual spend and investment. A lot of it is, focused and, monopolized by the emergence of the Saudi film universe and that $1 billion box office target that has been, put out there, and all the investment that's going into, whether it's productions, whether it's in facilities, whether it's through training, whether it's through co-productions and rebates and all of that. So that's a big one. Right. There is, but there's, like I said, like films born out of strife is the name of the game, in the region. Like it's actually miraculous sometimes, to see that these films continue to be made year after year from countries like, Lebanon and Iraq and Palestine. Like the fact that we have a real Palestine film festival, sometimes like we don't even stop to think about it, but like it's not just about like, oh, okay, there are these films that exist and we want to just put them up on the big screen. Like, do you know what it took, for this filmmaker to be able to tell the story and to make this film? A film like Gaza Mon Amour, which is a love story starring Hiam Abbas, and it's, filmmakers from Gaza, Tarzan and Arab Nasser, who are twins, and they had to leave Gaza through some miracle. Their families, ended up in Paris, and they're fighting for funds left, right, and center to make those films happen. It's not the same life cycle of a filmmaker based, or from, the UK or from the United States. They have their own challenges and their own problems, but the region is just like a constant fight.
But it's so far removed from that, isn't it? Yeah.
So I think that's like that sort of common denominator of struggle is the sort of background and the backdrop that sometimes gets removed from the conversation around the film, because you end up with this powerful film about cats, and you end up with a film about this woman, having a phantom pregnancy, like Inshallah a Boy by Amjad al-Rashid, which we just released, Okay. You have beautiful, sort of very personal archival films, that are just obsessed with personal narrative as a, kind of peephole into a whole history. Like a film like Memory Box, for example, by Joanna Hadji Toma and Khail Jrej, Lebanese filmmakers. They're a duo. They're artist filmmakers. And, it's their latest film. And it's, it talks about everything from, love today to diasporic living and experience and identity, the Civil War, archive, destruction of memory, like all in a very beautiful, 90-minute, like love affair, with the city that it's trying to keep alive in our memory. Beirut in this case.
Yeah.
So I think there's a certain kind of like digging your heels in trend across the board through different modalities that remains, whether it's like insistence on archive, like, before this gets destroyed or lost, whether it's capturing someone before they die and like telling a full 90-minute feature about a character that represents that historical moment, like for example Aida Returns, by Carol Mansour, a film about her mom. And, the whole film was made, before she died. And it was sort of, carving out. It's like, giving people their flowers or erecting those statues that will never get erected.
That was very poetic, by the way.
Thank you.
Butheina, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is for the opportunity to talk to people doing things a little bit different, or doing things first, or taking a risk. And I think you qualify in kind of all of those areas in many ways. You kind of fit the definition. And I want to pick your brains for some of the wisdom that you've managed to pick up along the way, taking into account your kind of cinema background, if you like. I mean, you must have been told, this is not going to work. The multiplexes rule, streaming rules. Everybody's got a big widescreen TV these days. So what was it that gave you the push and the confidence? I mean, the rent of a space frightens me in Al-Quds or wherever, for example. So your wisdom's kind of key. Could you talk me through some of the mistakes you made along the way, and what you learned and how you kind of fixed them, how you rectified them? What comes to mind first of all?
Look, I mean, it's it's a pretty precarious, line of work.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's
that I decided to throw myself into, and I
boy,
really
did you!
Yeah, and look, I have no wisdom to relay. I think I don't really believe in wisdom. I don't really believe in these like aha moments or these sort of snippets of of confidence. Like I think go online and find the quotable quotes of the world. I think there are better sources than than my personal experience. I think for me it was it was just a reflex and inevitability and sort of my own little battle.
So were you just kind of feet first, whatever happens, this is what I'm going to do? Was that
Head first.
your...
It was like...
Was it really, you were just like, right, this is what I'm going to do. Doesn't matter.
Yes, but I also, I am very... allergic to the idea of the solo flyer narrative, like that there's this like one hero of any story that took the bull by the horns and like like this whole new frontiers story. Like that's never the case. Like it's never a single person or single attitude endeavor. It's like I think it's always a whether it's accidental, whether it's serendipitous, whether it's designed, and you never really know, right? Like you have people that bet on us in the beginning. You had people that helped me do everything that I didn't know how to do. There were people that manned and womaned the doors. There were people that decided, what, screw it, like this is not lucrative, but I'm going to do it anyway. There are filmmakers that made their films with the same spirit. So a lot of that wisdom and a lot of that yearning came from them doing that work And all it took was for me to create a space where that was given the rightful, respect, and, where the dues were paid somehow.
But it's not just a space, is it, that you've created? You've kind of not just created, but you've inculcated. You've kind of warmed a community.
Well, I mean, space metaphorically or physically, right?
Yeah.
There's doors and there's walls and there's, acoustic, surfaces. And then there's actual space, like mental space. It's, like metaphorical space of bringing people together. And I think for me, that was it. Like, it's, sometimes we are, especially in a, a sort of a hyper capitalistic context, you're constantly trying to make a pseudo rational decision, that would be the most logical, that would pass the best feasibility, that would, get picked by a shark, that would,
for sure,
the elevator pitch that would win, the funding round, that you would close. And those are all legitimate pursuits, but I think, the beauty of our species is that we are also victims and, I think, survivors, with our emotiveness, with our irrationality, with our sense of collectiveness, that we've always, and collaboration. And I think this is the spirit in which something like an art house cinema can thrive. And that there is no kind of Excel sheet that can explain.
No, I can imagine. But I mean, that everything you've just said is kind of wisdom in and of itself, really. So I think that it's useful. Let me ask you one more thing, and then I'm going to come to the kind of final question, the question that we ask everybody on this podcast. If you had to start over, what would you do differently, do you think? If anything.
I mean, I don't really dwell in a lot of, retrospective thinking, I think it's like I'm always obsessed with what I'm going to do next, or what I'm going to do more of and what I'm going to fix. So that sort of, hyper present view governs like the majority of the way that I personally operate. I think, perhaps I would have invested more in people and in partnerships in terms of, like hiring more people in the outset, maybe seeking out a co-founder in the beginning, like that maybe would have saved me some steps, maybe would have, helped put in a lot of the nuts and bolts that we had to learn along the way that wouldn't have been so difficult had I brought, a financial advisor earlier on, had I spent less time like doing a lot of the physical kind of like planning and heavy lifting and left it to, the sort of the folks that actually do this day in, day out, maybe, but then again, that could have been the reason why I'm so kind of interwoven, with every aspect of it. So you never know.
You've done it all now, haven't you? You
never know.
Okay.
But I want to make sure, like the one thing I'll say is, I would do, this is what I'm actually working towards now. And I would, possibly have done it much earlier, is to make sure that, the ship floats, whether I'm on it or not, whether I'm steering or not, like making sure that there is a second, line of defense or even a first line of defense that is there, that is as capable, that, believes in it ultimately, in the same way. And also, brings in, something new. And I think that requires certain kind of, I think, discipline, to decouple and some grace in terms of like the perfectionism by which you want to do things.
Final question for you, and we ask this of everybody that comes on. So what would you like to see happen or change or affect most in the world? And what would you like most to unbox? And this can be cinema or more broadly. And why would you like to unbox that change?
I think ultimately it comes down to justice for me. And, we played the role of advocacy for justice through the big screen and, carving justice of space and justice of representation and justice of narrative, in terms of this idea of sharing films and, and showcasing films that are underrepresented, and are the voice of the unvoiced. I don't even say voiceless because they have voices, they're just not given the mic or the rightful places. And I think, if I were to, flip a switch today, it would be the removal of this capacity, the human capacity to see each other as variable in our deserving of that justice and of that equality, and that othering that we have the capacity to do, onto each other, that breeds everything from conflict to, injustice to genocide, on the furthest end of the spectrum, to hostility, to xenophobia. That is a preoccupation, and that is, leading to that that polarity, like the polarization that we are witnessing today. And that's a scary place to be. It's an ugly place to be. And I would really just, be able to, if I could have one superpower, it would be that.
Butheina Kazim is the founder of Cinema Akil. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
I mean that. Thank you.
Right back at you. Thank you, Tim.